So, and this PowerPoint has been visible to you. It's in Blackboard. Well, here's the thing. David Hume, who wrote at the end of the 18th century, around the time of our founding fathers, was a very skeptical philosopher. And he tried to argue that morality was more a matter of sentiment, of feelings, than anything that reason had anything to do with. And basically, it means that reasoning about moral right and wrong is not something that, if Hume's skepticism is correct, that we can really do effectively. But not everyone was convinced by Hume's skepticism. Many people thought, as did Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and the ancients, that we could reason about right and wrong. We could reason about a moral matter and in making a moral decision. But they thought if we're going to answer Hume's skeptical position, we have to talk about moral right and wrong in a new way, or at least in a way that just doesn't make it have to do with some ethereal principles in something like Plato's Heaven of Ideas, where the forms were, or with ideas in the mind of God, as someone like Augustine would have thought. We have to bring moral reasoning down to earth. And we're going to see the way that they did that was to adopt the standard for moral goodness that the ancient Greeks used, that we saw Aristotle used, but also some philosophers before Aristotle. And basically they adopted hedonism, which talks about morality as a matter of promoting the most happiness or pleasure, or at least lessening the amount of pain in society as a whole, or at least for everyone affected by what we do. So utilitarianism then wants us to compare things like pains and pleasures and come out on the side with the least pain or the most pleasure as the morally right course of action. So that's why you have the chemical balance. Now, we did not look at ethical egoism. It also fits into a broad category of moral theories called consequentialist theories. What they have in common is that they all hold, all consequentialist theories, that only the results of what we do are relevant to whether what we do is morally right or morally wrong. In other words, you want to figure out the right course of action, the only place you need to look are the results or the possible consequences. You want to figure out between A and B, what's the best choice morally? Well, compare A and B in terms of their consequences, and the best choice is the choice with the best consequences. Now, that's what consequentialist theories hold in general, that it's only consequences that are relevant. The word moral quality is kind of a technical way that ethicists have of talking about moral right and wrong. In other words, the moral quality of an action has to do with whether it's morally right or morally wrong. So consequentialists say the only thing you need to look at are the results of what you do. Now, when I made this little diagram up, when I was doing these slides, it wasn't an accident that I put the consequences here with the arrows going this way. That was meant to be suggestive of something. Think about it. Where, in terms of a timeline, where are the results or the consequences of what you do located? Past, present, or future? Yeah, in the future, right? And this was meant to be suggestive of that. Now, that's a strength, but some think it's also a drawback of this way of reasoning about morality, because from a moral point of view, it makes anything done in the past irrelevant. But suppose I promised to do something for you in the past, or promised to repay a loan. Well, that's looking back to the past for what I ought to do. Now, non-consequentialist theories can take this into account, but not consequentialist views. However, egoism and utilitarianism differ in how they answer the question, consequences for whom? Now, egoism is a very controversial theory because it says that the only consequences that I need to take into account are those that affect me personally, if I'm the doer of the action. That's why I have all the arrows pointed to only one of these figures. In other words, it's only the consequences for me that I need to take into account. Well, that seems very good until you look at situations where I might interact with somebody else. Suppose I'm a repair mechanic, and I know that somebody's problem can be corrected by a $200 repair. But I know that if I convince them that they really need a $1,000 repair, that they don't absolutely need, I'll make more money, and so the consequences for me of repairing their car are going to be better in terms of the money I make. Well, controversially, ethical egoism seems to suggest that the right course of action for me as a mechanic is that course of action where the consequences are best for me. So it's morally right, it seems to say, by egoism to recommend a $1,000 repair even if you don't need it. And you can say, well, what about the consequences for you, that you're now out $800 more, and in a sense you've been harmed by that? Well, egoism says the consequences for you are irrelevant. But most people think that that's not the way we ought to be making moral decisions, that we ought to be able to stand back from things and say, well, how does this decision affect everybody, around me? And utilitarianism has gotten to be a very popular point of view because it says the consequences I need to take into account when deciding on something are the consequences for everyone affected by my decision. Or if it's a major policy decision like universal health care or something, the consequences for the whole of society. So that's why I have those arrows going to everybody. It's everyone affected by what I do. Well, I asked my other class who just left, do they still teach geometry in high school? Some people do. Yeah. So some of you have had to take it. And you know that you end up proving theorems and corollaries, or at least they do it in the book, right? And so you know a particular theorem is true because it's provable. But what's it ultimately provable from? Well, it's ultimately provable from a few simple assumptions that you were exposed to at the beginning of a geometry course from the axioms. And everything else in the system is derived from those few statements. Things like things equal to the same things are equal to one another. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And they're held to be just obviously, self-evidently true. Well, one of the things that has attracted to people to utilitarianism is the whole thing seems to be based on one basic principle. And Bentham even says that he thinks of this as being like an axiom in geometry, as what everything is derived from. And it's called the principle of utility. And this is a quote from an earlier version, so this might not be the right page for your current version of Solomon. But always act for the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Okay? This was, I think, a quote from a business ethics textbook I used. Always act so as to bring about the greatest net good for all those affected by our actions. Well, these talk about bringing about the most good for the greatest number. The greatest good for the greatest number is the way it's often said. But you can say, well, what do you mean by good? Well, here's where Bentham tried to get morality very down to earth. He developed, or he adopted, a standard for moral goodness that was used by the ancient Greeks called hedonism, where basically for hedonists, the good is what promotes pleasure. The good is the pleasurable. So they define moral goodness in terms of the promotion of pleasure or the lessening of pain. So for Bentham, then, morality becomes a matter of making those choices that bring about the most good in terms of the most happiness or pleasure in society as a whole, or at least cause less pain, all things considered. And Bentham more or less took pleasure and happiness to be interchangeable. Now, Bentham's original statement of the principle of utility was a little convoluted, and it's found on page, well, first of all, on page 503, before I get to the principle of utility, at Roman numeral number 1 at the bottom of the page, Bentham adopts the hedonistic standard as a way to define moral goodness. He says, and this is a very famous quote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do as well as to determine what we shall do." So, you know, he thinks that we ought to look to things in this world. In other words, we don't know what Plato's form of the good was. We don't know, we can't, in other words, there are supranatural standards beyond this world, either in like a Platonic sense, that there are just moral principles written into the whole fabric of the universe, or in the sense that Augustine would have said, ideas in the mind of God, or that morality is tied to the will of God. Now, Bentham and Mill weren't trying to be anti-religious or anti-Christian, because they're writing in a Christian nation, but they're trying to get morality down to earth to answer Hume's criticisms. And so we know what the pains and pleasures, or what happiness and unhappiness of people that we meet with every day is. And for him, it's a matter of promoting the most happiness for the greatest number in society, or the least pain. So here is his statement of the principle of utility, and it's kind of convoluted in flowery 19th century language. It's in the second sentence in Roman numeral 2 on page 504. Bentham says, by the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever. In other words, he means you can judge anything you might want to do by this principle to figure out its rightness or wrongness. Of any action whatsoever, according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what is the same thing, in other words, to promote or to oppose that happiness. And he says, I say of every action whatsoever, and therefore not only of every action of a private individual, but of every measure of government. Remember, Bentham wanted to reform the British legal system. So he wanted to get out a different way for makers of public policy in government to figure out what's the right policy in a moral sense. And this theory affects public policy decisions even today. As I said, Cass Sunstein in the present administration has said that, you know, I want every policy decision of the federal government to be measured by the utilitarian standard of a cost-benefit analysis. And he is self-admittedly a utilitarian. So let's move on then. So what is hedonism? They adopt hedonism, and Bentham's statement of the principle of utility assumes that good is going to be defined in a hedonistic way as happiness or pleasure. That's why it's called the greatest happiness or principle. There's a distinction between whether something is intrinsically good, and I'm not going to ask you that term. And what we mean by saying something's intrinsically good, we mean it's good for its own sake, not because it promotes some other good, but just for its own sake alone. And basically, for hedonism, only pleasure or happiness is good for its own sake and to be pursued for its own sake alone. Any other good, other things can be considered good for a hedonist, but in the end, they're only good insofar as they promote happiness or lessen pain. I mean, one example from a textbook I used to use says, you can say, well, it's good to eat healthy foods. And somebody says, well, why is it good to eat healthy foods? And you say, well, I mean, if you eat healthy foods, you'll be healthier yourself in body and mind. I can say, well, you know, why is it good to be healthier in body and mind? And somebody might say, well, you know, people who are in a better state of health, people who are healthier, have a happy, more pleasurable life. But if we then would go on to say, but why is it good to be happy? For for the hedonist, the buck stops there. Happiness is worth pursuing for its own sake. It's a good in itself, and not for the sake of something else. Other things are good insofar as they aim ultimately at increasing happiness or reducing pain. But the only thing worth promoting for its own sake is happiness. Now, this is an important point later we'll see in what Mill tries to do with this theory. So now for Bentham, then, pleasure and happiness are more or less interchangeable. Now, John Stuart Mill tried later than Bentham to prove in a logical way that we all ought to be hedonists. However, and there's I tell my logic students this too. In fact, we're looking at this very kind of fallacy. He commits a Logic 101 error called a fallacy of ambiguity, where you use a word or a phrase with two different meanings. And so your argument doesn't work because you've changed the meaning in midstream. And John Stuart Mill wrote one of the most popular logic textbooks used in the 19th century, but he still makes a Logic 101 error when he writes in ethics. He says that pleasure is desirable as an end, as a goal, as what we are, as the end of our moral thinking. It's seen from this that it is the one thing people actually do desire. Well, that's basically using desirable in the sense of saying it's something that is able to be desired by people. And he even says, if I ask whether a sound is audible, I want to say, well, is it able to be heard by people? And similarly, he says something that's desirable means it's something that's able to be desired by people, what they actually desire. But that's not what he's supposed to be proving. He's supposed to be proving this is what we ought to desire as a supreme end of morality. So in his premise, he uses desirable in the sense that, like audible, that it's desirable in the sense that pleasure is able to be desired by people. But he never shows that it's what we ought to desire, which is his conclusion. But he uses desirable in two senses. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this subtlety, but it's interesting historically. Now, the big word to remember in connection with Bentham's view is the word quantity. Basically, how do we balance things out when we're making a moral decision? Well, by weighing the quantity of pain or pleasure on each side and choosing the side with the most happiness or pleasure or the least amount of pain or unhappiness. Now, Bentham, as often happens in a theory, the first person who thinks it up is very simple in the way they construct it. And Bentham thought that the only thing we need to worry about for the purpose of utilitarian reasoning, we're making calculations, is the quantity of a pleasure. His famous quote is that pushpin is as good as poetry, or the entire quote is quantity of pleasure being the same, pushpin's as good as poetry. Pushpin is a simple game like pickup sticks. So you see what he's saying? He says all pleasures are on a par if their quantity is the same. So a simple child's game like pick-up sticks is as good as, say, something like reading, the poetry of Maya Angelou or of Longfellow or whatever, or of going to a symphony. If you get as much pleasure, from pushpin as from poetry, then that's all that matters for utilitarian reasoning. This gets him into trouble later. Now, Bentham also thought, now don't let the word calculus worry you. A calculus is just a system within which calculations can be made. We're not talking about the calculus, developed by Newton and Laplace, and when you take the course as a textbook, 3 inches thick, Really, you're going to see we're just talking about adding positive and negative numbers. But Bentham thought that we could actually compare pains and pleasures quantitatively. Now, what is it if we say we can talk about something not quantitatively, but quantitatively? What do we mean by saying that? We can talk about how cold or warm this room is quantitatively. How? We can measure how warm this room is. How do we measure it? Well, by a countable unit, whether it's a degree Fahrenheit or a degree centigrade. So when we say we can talk about something quantitatively, we mean we can measure it, right? We can measure the length of this table up here. Why? Because we have units like millimeters or inches that we could measure it in. So being able to measure something presupposes that you've got some kind of countable unit. And for Bentham, and this is one of those things where you can't make this kind of stuff up, he talked about a hedon as the standard of pleasure and pain, the countable unit. So plus 1 hedon would be 1 unit of pleasure or happiness, minus 1 hedon would be a unit of pain or unhappiness. And Bentham thought that we could actually compare pleasures and pains. Now, how would we assign values? Now, he talks about this on page 505, things like intensity, duration, certainty or uncertainty. In other words, an intense pleasure would get a higher plus value, right? An intense pain would get a negative value. How long a pleasure or pain occurred would affect what number you'd give to it. Its duration in time. You would presumably like something that's pleasurable to last longer. On the other hand, we have a multi-billion-dollar pain-relieving industry because if you can take a Tylenol or a Motrin and get rid of that headache in 20 minutes, and otherwise it's going to last 3 hours, you want a pain to be the shortest duration of time possible. Okay? So Bentham thought you would take into account factors like the intensity of a pain or pleasure, how long it lasted, certainty or uncertainty. The way I like to illustrate it is this. Suppose you already had some gas in your tank, but you wanted to fill it up. And you're getting $1 back from your $20 bill at the gas station. And it's burning a hole in your pocket, so to speak. So you say, well, okay, I'm here at the gas station. I could spend that $1 on a lottery ticket, or I could buy a Hershey bar, which I like. Well, if you decide to buy the Hershey bar rather than play the lottery, think about it. If you won hundreds or thousands of dollars in the lottery, you'd probably get a lot more pleasure from that than you would from one measly little Hershey bar. But there's 100% chance that I'm going to have the pleasure of eating the Hershey bar if I pay my $1. Whereas there's not much certainty that I'm going to win even on a 3-digit number in the lottery, right? So things like certainty, thought, would come into account. And there were other, whether or not a pain or pleasure leads to a sensation of like or of a different kind, you know, stuff like that. But at any rate, he thought we could take these factors into account and assign numerical values to pains and pleasures. Now, here's how utilitarian calculations are made. Now, we saw a very complicated example in the public policy decision in the video about whether or not to build the Bakun Dam, you know, a hydroelectric dam. Huge decision. A lot of complications in that. But if you can see with a little simple example how utilitarian reasoning is made, you can apply that principle to a more complex case like the Bakun Dam. And this is a case that I've used for years that I originally got out of the old Edwards Encyclopedia of, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which we probably have over there in the library. It used to be if you were a grad student in philosophy, one of the things you had to do in your graduate career at some point was join the Book of the Month Club, because you could get the Encyclopedia of Philosophy for free as a premium, and then you just buy X number of books over the course of 2 years. You'd keep your contract, and then you'd cancel it. And yes, I have sitting on my shelves. It's in 8 volumes, but they compressed it down to 4. And so at any rate, I got this example, but it illustrates utilitarian reasoning very well. Suppose you have a moral decision to make, a simple moral decision. This Saturday, you have the option either of taking your nephew to the circus or of just staying home and reading a book that you like. And so you're a Benthamite utilitarian, so you want to make this decision as a utilitarian would and say, well, I want to do the morally right thing. Well, suppose circuses for you don't do a lot for you. Circuses for you, been there, done that. So you're going to be kind of bored, right? Well, let's say the uncle's boredom is -5 hedons, right? Because boredom is a mild type of pain, or at least an unpleasantness, right? I mean, not everything in life is as exciting as philosophy class. There are boring things out there. Trust me. Trust me on this one. Right? Now, how many of you have, if you have a small child or you have younger siblings, you see them opening a birthday gift or maybe a Christmas gift, and you get pleasure out of just seeing how happy they are at opening, when they're opening the gift. We call that sympathetic pleasure, right? Pleasure in another person's happiness. Well, if the uncle takes the nephew to the circus and the nephew likes the circus, he'll get a certain amount of sympathetic pleasure out of it. Let's call it +2 hedons. However, the nephew, if he really likes the circus, might get a whole 10 hedons worth of pleasure out of it. Now, like I say, this is simple math here. And just to keep the example simple and to not deviate from the one that was in there, note if you've got plus 12 minus 5 gives you plus 7. So on this side, your A choice gives you plus 7 hedons worth of pleasure. So you say, well, what if I decide to stay home and read the book? Well, often adults don't get the intensity of pleasures and pains that children do. So let's say you're going to get some pleasure from reading the book, but not as much as your nephew would from the circus. So let's call it plus 6 hedons worth of pleasure. Whoa. However, you know you've disappointed your nephew, and so you're going to have a certain amount of sympathetic pain or unpleasantness knowing that you've disappointed your nephew. And of course, there's your nephew's actual disappointment. So call the sympathetic pain at disappointing him minus 2 hedons and this at minus 8. Well, here if you do the math, you have minus 4 hedons. Now, in utilitarian reasoning, it's not always a plus versus a minus. It might be 2 minuses, it might be 2 pluses. But you're saying what has more pluses than minuses and what side does? Pretty obvious, right? This side. So what's the morally right choice for the uncle to make? To take the nephew to the circus. Now, I want to point out one thing. Utilitarian reasoning enables us to stand back from a situation and take what philosophers call the moral point of view. That is a completely objective point of view. Make a decision. What's the right thing here? As if it didn't affect you personally when it really does. Note that if we just looked at this from the uncle's perspective, here it's minus 5 hedons and plus 2 hedons for the uncle. So it's minus 3 hedons for the uncle over here. And here it's plus 6 minus 2 or plus 4 hedons. Note, the uncle himself, just by himself, actually gets more pleasure from this choice. But you're not an egoist, you're a utilitarian, and you're saying, I want to take into account the consequences for everybody affected. And when you do that, on balance, there's more pleasure here. Now, is everybody okay with these numbers? Everybody can see how we get the numbers that we have here? I mean, that's not a problem for anyone, is it? You can see why that's minus 5 and why that would be plus 10, and you know, so everyone is cool with the exact numbers we have here. Oh, okay, you guys are way too agreeable. In a way, that's meant to be a sort of trick question, because now I've been trying over the past week. It's like, gosh, I have a friend whose horse, I've been trying to be supportive, even to the point of loaning her some money to get some x-rays done. She was worried that her horse may have a very serious thing with its hoof. And then while she's got that problem going on, her 88-year-old mother falls and breaks her hip. Well, she's not 88 yet. She'll be 88 on Halloween. So I've been going with her and visiting her mother who's had surgery at GBMC. In the hospitals, they actually have a pain chart for patients. Some of you might work in the medical field, but from 1 to 10, right? And so, you know, if a patient says, well, my pain in my hip was only 4 yesterday, but boy, it's an 8 today. You know the pain is more intense. But can you really make exact, I mean, that's still fly by the seat of your pants comparisons. Can you really make those exact comparisons? Well, some people think that a criticism of the way Bentham wants to use it is that it's unrealistic to think that we can assign exact numbers. And here's the problem. One is that pains and pleasures are subjective. They're not open to, public inspection for everybody to agree, oh, yeah, this person is having, is minus 5 hedons worth of pain now. But also, because they're subjective, it seems like it's pretty much impossible to agree on a standard unit that everybody would say, oh, okay, well, that's what we should count as 1 hedon's worth of pleasure or minus 1 hedon's worth of pain. In other words, there are very exact standards for what an inch is, what a meter, what a millimeter is, what a degree Kelvin is. These things are defined very exactly and scientifically. But can we do the same with a hedon? Probably not. In fact, pretty certainly not. But here's the problem. How do you know whether you have 2 or 10 or 20 of something unless you know what counts as having 1 of that thing? And if you can't figure out in an exact way what counts as having 1 hedon's worth of pleasure, how can you assign any numbers, when you don't know that exactly? And so that's a problem with Bentham's view that we could compare pleasures and pains exactly. Now, it is true we make rough and ready comparisons. We do say things like, my headache yesterday, or my headache is much worse today than the one I had yesterday. But still, that's not to say, though, that we can make exact numerical comparisons. And even that chart of 1 through 10 it's the best gut-level guess of the patient, subjectively. So this is one criticism. Now, we'll see one way you get around this problem is by adopting a countable unit that everybody knows and can define, and a cost-benefit analysis using the dollar as a standard is utilitarian reasoning, using a unit that we know what it is. We know it counts as having $1. And it counts less and less every day. But at any rate, so very often policies are decided using a cost-benefit analysis, where benefits, where moral good is interpreted as economic benefits to society, and the reverse of that is economic costs, and that's one of the ways to figure out a complex situation like the Bakun Dam. Okay, well, I'm going to stop here. We're going to look next at John Stuart Mill, because Bentham got in trouble, and utilitarianism was criticized by people for taking a very low view of what human beings are. Bentham's claim that all pleasures are on a par seemed to draw no distinction between the pleasures of, say, the pig out in the field eating slop and the sophisticated poetry reader, sitting reading Maya Angelou, or the person going to the symphony. And so John Stuart Mill tried to complicate Bentham's theory but respond to criticisms by saying, well, we need to talk about quality of pleasures, not just quantity. So we're going to see how he did that. But again, I know this stuff is a little tedious, but this is, as I said, a really influential moral theory, you know. So, okay, we'll see you all Friday. Have a good rest of the day. And someone get me the roll, or did I pass the roll around? Oh, okay. If anyone missed the roll, here, I'll leave a red pen. Yeah, you can sign it.